He was standing at the edge of the set, not performing, not waiting to be introduced, just standing there in the afternoon light with a glass in his hand that he had not touched. The crew was moving. The cameras were being repositioned. Steve McQueen was somewhere in the middle of all of it, talking to his director, not looking up. And Dean Martin watched him the way a man watches something he cannot quite place. Not with admiration, not with hostility, with something quieter than both. There were people on that set who had worked with Dean for years. They said later that they had never seen him stand that still. Dean Martin was a man who moved through rooms, the way music moves through a speaker. Effortless, constant, filling the space. Standing still was not something he did, but he was standing still that afternoon. And the glass in his hand was untouched. Something was about to happen on that set that nobody planned for. Nobody wrote it into a schedule. Nobody prepared for it. But when it was over, two of the most difficult men in Hollywood had looked at each other in a way that neither one of them ever quite explained. This is not a story about a film set. This is a story about what happens when two men who have built their entire lives around never needing anyone end up in the same room, and one of them decides to walk over. It was the autumn of 1963. Hollywood was in the middle of a particular kind of tension that year. The studio system that had controlled everything, the contracts, the images, the careers, was cracking at the edges. New money was coming in, new faces, new rules. The men who had built their reputations in the 1940s and 50s were not gone yet, but they could feel something shifting beneath them. The old arrangement had been simple. The studio told you who you were. They named you, dressed you, photographed you. They decided what the public would believe about you, and they protected that belief with contracts and publicists, and carefully managed silences. That system had given men like Dean Martin a kind of stability that had nothing to do with truth. It had given them a version, and the version was safe. By 1963, the version was no longer enough. Television had changed what audiences wanted. They wanted something that looked unguarded, something that felt like they were seeing the actual person and not the photograph the studio had approved. The old stars had been trained to give nothing. The new ones were being asked to give everything. And the men who had survived by controlling the distance suddenly found themselves in a world that wanted them to close it. Dean Martin was 46 years old. He had just come off the Rat Pack years, the Sands, the shows, the films with Frank and Sammy. He had been everywhere, and he had been everything, and he had done it all while making it look like he was barely trying. That was the act. That was the genius of the act. Dean walked out with a drink in his hand and made you feel like the night had just gotten better, like you had been waiting for him without knowing it. That was the job. He executed it every night for 40 years. But there was something underneath the ease that his oldest friends knew about and almost never discussed. You know that feeling when you have been somewhere so long that people stop seeing you. When the room knows your name but not your weight. When the applause is real but the attention is not. Dean had that. He had been performing since he was a teenager in Steubenville, Ohio, playing clubs where the crowd was loud and indifferent. And the only way to survive the night was to make them feel like you did not need them. He had learned very early that the best defense against a room that does not care about you is to perform as if you do not care either. He had been building a version of himself since before most people in that industry had their first job. And by 1963, the version he had built was so polished, so perfectly constructed, that it was almost impossible to see the man inside it, even the people who loved him. His wife Jean once said in a private conversation, reported years later by a mutual friend, that there were entire evenings when she could not tell whether she was having dinner with Dean or with Dean Martin. She said it without cruelty. She said it the way you say something that is simply true and has been true for so long that the sadness has gone out of it. That tells you something about the distance. That tells you something about the cost of the version. Steve McQueen was 33 that year. He had arrived in Hollywood from somewhere entirely different. Reformatories, the Marines, a childhood in Indianapolis and later in California that had left marks he did not talk about and never pretended were not there. He had made The Magnificent Seven in 1960. He had made The Great Escape in 1963, a film that had opened that summer to the kind of reception that changes the terms of a career permanently. McQueen had become, in the space of a few months, one of the most watched men in the country. Not because he was charming, not because he made you feel welcome, because he made you feel like you were watching something real, even when you knew it was not real. That was the trick. And it was not a trick at all. It was simply that McQueen could not perform comfort. He could not perform ease. What he could do was be completely, totally, uncomfortably present in a scene. And presence, it turned out, was what audiences had been waiting for. He was not the kind of man who walked into rooms and made them feel warm. He walked in and made them feel awake. There was a difference. McQueen did not perform ease. McQueen performed precision. Every word measured, every movement considered. He had a reputation on sets for being difficult in the specific way that truly talented people are difficult. Not because they are cruel, but because they will not accept anything less than real. These two men had been circling each other's world for years. They had friends in common, sets in common, cities in common. But they had never really landed in the same room in a way that required anything from either of them. Until that afternoon. The film McQueen was shooting was a production that had been complicated from the beginning. There had been rewrites, schedule changes, a director who had left and been replaced. By the time Dean walked onto that set, the whole thing had the feeling of something that had been pulled back together after almost coming apart. Dean had no official reason to be there. He knew someone on the crew, a sound engineer named Ray Beckett, who had worked with Dean on 2 pictures in the late 1950s. Ray had called him that morning, not to invite him, just to say hello. Dean had driven over. That was the kind of man Dean Martin was in those years. He showed up, not always when he was supposed to, but when someone he liked needed him to be somewhere, he was there. Ray later said he was surprised Dean actually came. He had said it casually. He had not expected it to mean anything, but Dean had driven 40 minutes across the city for a conversation with a sound engineer who had called to say hello. That tells you something about Dean Martin that the public version never quite showed. He was on the set by 2 in the afternoon. Ray had walked him around, introduced him to a few crew members. Ordinary afternoon, comfortable, no particular tension. And then McQueen came back from lunch. He did not see Dean immediately. He was focused on something his director was saying, a question about a particular shot, and he had that expression he sometimes had when the work was the only thing in the room. The crew noticed Dean before McQueen did. A few of them recognized him. One of the younger grips said later that the entire atmosphere of the set changed when Dean walked in, the way a room gets warmer when someone opens a door from outside. That was Dean's gift. He could not turn it off. Even when he was not performing, he was somehow performing. McQueen looked up. He saw Dean across the set, and he did not smile. That was the first thing people noticed. McQueen was not unfriendly. That was not what it was. He just looked at Dean the way he looked at everything. Carefully. Directly. Without the social softening that most people put between themselves and a moment when they are not sure what the moment requires. Dean raised his glass slightly, a gesture. Easy, unbothered. The most Dean Martin gesture possible. McQueen held his look for a moment, and then he went back to talking to his director. The crew went back to work. Ray went back to his equipment. Dean stood where he was. And here is what nobody ever talks about. Dean Martin stayed. He did not make excuses to leave. He did not find somewhere else to be. He stood at the edge of that set for the next 40 minutes while McQueen worked, watching a man 30 years younger than him approach a scene with an intensity that Dean had not seen up close in a long time. Now see it from Dean's side for a moment. He was a man who had been the most comfortable person in every room he had ever entered. That was not arrogance. That was training. That was 40 years of learning how to own a space without appearing to try. And here was someone who owned the space in a completely different way. Not by warming it, but by refusing to pretend it was anything other than what it was. What was Dean watching for? What was he looking at in a man he barely knew? For 40 minutes on a Tuesday afternoon, nobody asked him. He never said. But Ray Beckett said that Dean's expression in those 40 minutes was unlike anything he had seen on Dean's face before. Not admiration exactly. Something more complicated. Something that looked almost like recognition. 3 people saw Dean Martin stand still on that set for 40 minutes. None of them said anything about it for years. That tells you everything about how strange it was. McQueen broke between setups. He walked toward the water table at the edge of the set, and he passed close enough to Dean that stopping was the natural thing. He stopped. He looked at Dean. Dean looked at him. Neither one of them said anything for a moment. And then McQueen said something that the 2 or 3 people close enough to hear have described in slightly different ways over the years. One account says he said, "You have been standing there a long time." Another says he said, "You are not what I expected." A third account, from a camera operator named Phil Dunner, says McQueen looked at Dean and said simply, "You see it, do you not?" 3 accounts. They agree that something was said. On exactly what, they differ. What they all agree on is what Dean said back. Dean looked at McQueen. He took a slow drink from his glass, and he said, "The trick is making it look like you do not." There was a pause. McQueen looked at him, not through him, at him. And then he said, "That is not a trick I know." The people who heard it said the conversation lasted less than 3 minutes. They said neither man smiled. They said it had the quality of 2 people, confirming something they had both suspected without ever having spoken it aloud. Dean Martin and Steve McQueen had just told each other, in the plainest possible language, that they each knew what the other one was doing. Dean's trick was invisibility through performance. Make it look like nothing costs you anything. McQueen's was the opposite. Let them see exactly what it costs. Let the cost be the thing they cannot look away from. 2 completely different answers to the same problem. And both of them had spent their entire careers, proving that theirs was the right one. Now they were standing 6 feet apart, and neither one of them was performing. Dean Martin had 2 options in that moment. He could let it be what it was, a brief exchange between 2 men on an afternoon that did not need to mean anything. Or he could stay with it, push into it, see what was actually there. Most men would have let it go. Dean Martin was not most men. Here is the question nobody ever asked out loud. Was Dean right to push further? Or did what happened next cost him more than the moment was worth? Drop a comment. One line is enough. If stories like this are the kind that stay with you, subscribe. We find the moments that history almost forgot. What Dean did in the next 20 minutes, that was a different thing entirely. And it started, of all places, with a chair. He pulled one over, not asked, not invited. Dean Martin pulled a chair from the edge of the set and sat down near where McQueen was standing and started talking. Not performing, talking. The accounts of what they talked about come from three sources. Ray Beckett, who could hear portions of it from where he was working. Phil Donner, the camera operator, who was close for part of it. And a production assistant named Linda Marsh, who was walking back and forth across that part of the set for much of the conversation and who said later that she slowed down every time she passed near them. What they agree on, Dean talked about Steubenville, about the clubs he played before anyone knew his name, about learning to read a room when the room did not care whether you lived or died, about the years with Jerry Lewis, how that partnership had been the strangest thing he had ever been part of, and how when it ended he had not known, for a period he would not specify, who he was without it. That last part was not something Dean said in public, not in interviews, not on television. The Jerry Lewis split had been publicly framed as a business decision, a professional parting between two men who had grown in different directions. That was the version. That was what had been agreed on. But on that chair, on that set, Dane said something closer to what it had actually been. He said he had built so much of himself around that partnership that when it ended, the version he had been performing did not quite fit anymore. He had spent 2 or 3 years, he said, trying to figure out what was underneath it. McQueen listened. He did not interrupt. He did not offer his own stories in return. He just listened. And that, the listening, was its own kind of statement. McQueen was not a man who sat quietly for other people. His people, the producers and directors who had worked with him, would have found the image almost impossible to believe. McQueen sitting, McQueen still, McQueen listening, but he was. And then, and this is the part that Phil Donner said, he thought about for years afterward. McQueen said, "How did you decide what to keep?" Dean looked at him. He said, "You keep the part that is true, and you perform the rest. The audience cannot tell the difference. You can. That is the only difference that matters." McQueen sat with that. He looked down at the floor of the set. And then he said something that nobody has quoted exactly, but that Ray Beckett described as sounding like, "I do not know how to perform anything." Dean, according to Ray, looked at McQueen for a long moment and said, "I know." 2 words, not as a compliment, not as a criticism, as a statement of fact between 2 men who had just, in less than an hour, managed to see each other more clearly than most people who had known them for decades. You know that moment when someone sees you, not the version you perform, not the name they know, but the actual weight of you, and does not look away. Dean Martin had spent 40 years perfecting a performance designed to make sure that moment never happened. It had just happened. In a folding chair, on a film set he had no official reason to be on. McQueen was called back to work. He stood. He looked at Dean. He said, "Come back sometime." Not an invitation exactly, more like a permission. Dean stood, picked up his glass, and walked back to where Ray was working. Ray said Dean was quiet for the rest of the time he was there. Not uncomfortable, not unsettled, just quiet, which was, Ray said, the most unusual thing he had ever seen Dean Martin be. The set went back to normal within minutes. Cameras repositioned. director calling out adjustments, McQueen back in front of the lens, doing what he did with the total focused precision that had made him what he was. Nobody announced that anything had happened. Nobody pulled anyone aside. The afternoon just continued. From the outside, nothing had changed. A visitor had come and gone. A conversation had happened at the edge of a working set. The work continued. That was the surface. Dean drove home sometime around 4:30. He did not call anyone that night. He did not mention the set to his wife, Jane, who said later that he came home quieter than usual, but that quiet was not an alarm with Dean. Quiet just meant he was somewhere inside himself. She had learned, over the years, not to reach into that quiet uninvited. But she noticed it. She always noticed. In the weeks that followed, Dean did something he rarely did. He turned down 2 projects. Not because of scheduling. Not because of money. His agent at the time, Mort Vinner, said Dean told him the material did not feel like anything. That was not a phrase Dean used. Dean took what came and made it work. That was the system. That was always the system. Using the phrase does not feel like anything was not nothing. It was also around this period that Dean started arriving earlier to his own rehearsals. His musical director, Ken Lane, who had worked with Dean for close to 2 decades by then, said that in late '63 and into '64, Dean was more present in the room than he had been in years. Not louder, not more demonstrative. More there, Lane said. It was like he had decided to actually show up to something instead of just arriving at it. In interviews from that period, Dean smiled more than usual. He joked more than usual. He talked about everything except the things that were actually sitting with him. That was the tell. A man who is fine does not work that hard at seeming fine. Nobody connected any of this to an afternoon on a film set. Why would they? Nobody outside of 3 crew members knew the conversation had happened. Dean did not mention it in interviews. McQueen did not mention it. The afternoon had no official record. But here is the part that gets left out of every version of this story. McQueen made a decision in those same weeks that his people also found unusual. He had been offered a project that fit him perfectly. Everything about it was right. The character, the material, the director. He turned it down. When his agent pushed for a reason, McQueen said, "I want to try something I do not already know how to do." His agent said he had never heard McQueen say that before. McQueen had always gone toward what he was certain of. That was his method. Certainty, control. Trying something he did not know how to do was not in the vocabulary. 1 conversation. Less than an hour. No reporters. No cameras. No record. And 2 of the most self-contained men in Hollywood had both, in the weeks after, done something slightly outside of who they had decided to be. Whether that was coincidence, nobody left to ask and say. The 2 men did not become close. That was not what this was. They saw each other a handful of times in the years that followed. At industry events. At a party in Malibu in 1966 that several people have mentioned in separate memoirs, without connecting Dean and McQueen in any particular way. They were cordial. They were, by all accounts, genuinely pleased to see each other in the way that 2 people are pleased when they encounter someone they respected without having to maintain. But they did not pursue a friendship. They did not call. They did not write. 2 people who had looked at each other clearly and then, by mutual unspoken agreement, decided that one afternoon was enough. Some things are complete as they are. Adding to them only dilutes them. Dan Martin went on to make some of the most interesting work of his career in the years directly after '63. The Matt Helm films, his television series, the recordings from the mid-'60s that musicians still talk about. The ones where something underneath the ease is just slightly more visible than it used to be, not more performed. Less. Something underneath the performance that had gotten a degree closer to the surface. Ken Lane noticed it first. He said that around 64, 65, Dean started holding notes differently, not technically, in terms of what he was willing to let you hear. Lane said before, he was singing at you. After, he was singing from somewhere. I do not know what changed, but something did. The people who love Dean Martin's music most often say that the mid-60s recordings have a quality that the earlier ones do not. They struggle to name it. Warmth is the word they reach for first, but that is not quite right, because the earlier work was warm too. This was something else. This was warmth with weight behind it. Ease that had earned itself. Steve McQueen made Bullet in 1968. He made The Thomas Crown Affair. He made Le Mans. And in those films there is something that critics and actors have spent years trying to describe. A quality that sits between performance and pure presence, that does not have a clean name. Some people call it naturalism. Some call it stillness. Some call it not acting. McQueen himself, in a rare interview from 1971, said something that the interviewer included as a throwaway line, but that stopped certain people cold when they read it. He was asked about his technique. He said, "A man once told me the trick is making it look like you do not. I spent a long time figuring out what that meant. I am still not sure I have it." The interviewer did not ask who the man was. McQueen did not say. The quote sat in a magazine archive for years without anyone connecting it to an afternoon in 1963. Without anyone putting a name to the man who had said it. Until someone did. Dean Martin died in December of 1995. He was 78 years old. He had been, in his final years, quieter than the public had ever seen him. His son, Dean Paul, had died in a plane crash in 1987, a Marine Corps training exercise in the San Bernardino Mountains. After that, Dean had retreated in a way that everyone around him described in almost identical terms. He was present. He was kind. He was still himself. But something had gone somewhere that was not coming back. He stopped performing. He stopped taking calls from most of the people who had filled his life for decades. Frank Sinatra called regularly. Dean answered less and less often, not out of hostility, out of something quieter. He spent a great deal of time at a small Italian restaurant on La Cienega. He sat at the same table. He had the same meal. He was recognized constantly, and he was gracious constantly, and he went home and he sat by himself. The performance had finally ended, not dramatically, not with a statement. It had simply become unnecessary. Or perhaps the weight of carrying it had finally exceeded what the man inside it could hold. Steve McQueen had died 15 years before him, November of 1980. He was 50 years old, mesothelioma, a diagnosis that came late and moved fast. He had, in the months before he died, given several interviews that were unlike anything he had given before. Quieter, more willing to sit with a question, more willing to say, "I do not know." The man who had spent his career performing certainty was, in his final months, performing nothing. He was just there. Sick and honest, and completely present, in the way he had always been present on screen, but had rarely allowed himself to be in a room. The two men never had a final conversation. There was no closing of the loop, no moment where one said to the other what the afternoon on the set had meant. Whether Dean knew McQueen had quoted him, without naming him, in that 1971 interview. No one who was close to Dean in those years can say. Whether McQueen knew that Dean had changed something in how he worked, in how he let himself be heard, in the years after that afternoon. McQueen never said, The afternoon existed. Two people carried it. And then, one by one, they were gone. And the afternoon went with them. Into the archive, into the quiet, into the space between what happened and what anyone can prove. This is not a story about a film set. This is a story about two men who had each, in completely opposite ways, solved the same problem, how to be seen without being exposed, and who had, for less than an hour, set the solution down. Dean Martin's answer was performance so perfect that the performance became indistinguishable from the person. You watched Dean and you felt warmth and ease, and you did not look further because there was nothing in the presentation that invited you to. Steve McQueen's answer was exposure so controlled that the exposure itself became the armor. You watched McQueen and you felt you were seeing everything. And in that feeling of seeing everything, you stopped looking for what was not being shown. Both methods worked. Both methods cost something. Think about someone in your life who has it completely together, who always seems effortless, unaffected. Fine. You probably believe them. Most people do. But you know, because you have felt it yourself, that effortless is the hardest performance there is. The men we call cool are not men without weight. They are men who learned, very young, that showing the weight costs more than carrying it. Dean Martin carried his in a glass he rarely put down. McQueen carried his in a silence he rarely broke. On one Tuesday afternoon in 1963, they put both of those things down for a few minutes and said something true to each other. Control is not the absence of feeling. It is the decision about which feelings get to leave the room. The people we cannot quite see are not always hiding. Sometimes they are just very, very good at making the distance comfortable. And sometimes, rarely briefly, they find someone who is good at the same thing. And for a moment, neither one of them needs to be good at it. Before this ends, think about someone in your life. Someone who always seems fine, who has the version ready, who has the answer ready, whose ease you have never thought to question because the ease is so complete. Did you ever ask them what it actually costs? Or did you accept the performance the way everyone accepted Dean Martin's? Tell me in the comments. If this story reached something in you, subscribe. Not for me, for the next story, because the next one is about a man who built a version of himself so convincing that he eventually could not find his way back to the original. And it is heavier than this one. In his final years, Dean Martin kept a photograph on the table near his chair. It was not a famous photograph, not from a film, not from a show. It was a candid image from some point in the 1960s. An afternoon, by the look of the light. Dean was sitting down. He was not looking at the camera. He was looking at something just outside the frame. His face in that photograph was the face of a man who was not performing. His daughter said he looked at it often. She said she asked him once what he liked about it. He said, "I look like I am actually there." She did not know what he meant. She did not ask. He just looked at the photograph and said nothing. That was Dean Martin, a man who spent a lifetime making the distance feel like warmth, who learned, in a folding chair on a Tuesday afternoon, that someone else knew the distance was there, and who kept one photograph of the afternoon he forgot to perform it.